In 1944, a photograph was taken at a Nazi POW camp. Exhausted prisoners, starving faces. For decades, this image sat in archives as just another tragic war photograph. But in 2022, a historian using digital restoration discovered something hidden in the background that exposed one of World War II's most concealed atrocities. What she found wasn't supernatural, it was something far worse. The deliberate, systematic murder that the Nazis desperately tried to hide. This is the true story of Stalag 9B, and the war crime that 400 men witnessed but were ordered never to speak about. Dr. Emily Schneider had spent 12 years researching Holocaust documentation and war crimes at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. In March 2022, she was leading a digitization project to preserve thousands of deteriorating World War II photographs using advanced restoration technology. The photograph that changed everything was labeled American POWs, Stalag 9B, Bad Orb, Germany, February 1945. It showed approximately 60 Allied prisoners standing in formation during morning roll call, their faces gaunt, uniforms hanging loose on malnourished frames. A standard documentation of wartime suffering, heartbreaking but not unusual among the thousands of similar images Emily had processed. The AI enhancement software flagged an anomaly in the background, something inconsistent with the camp's official records. Emily zoomed into the area behind the prisoners, toward a structure labeled in German records as Lagerhaus 4, Storage Building 4. What she saw made her immediately contact the museum's director. Through a partially open door, barely visible in the original photograph, but crystal clear after enhancement, were bodies. Not one or two, but dozens. Emaciated corpses stacked like cordwood inside what was supposed to be an empty storage facility. But here's what made Emily's blood run cold. These weren't Jewish victims. According to the uniforms partially visible in the enhanced image, these were Soviet prisoners of war. And according to official German records submitted to the Red Cross, there were no Soviet POWs at Stalag 9B in February 1945. The records claimed the camp held only American, British, and French prisoners, all protected under Geneva Convention protocols. Emily knew immediately what she was looking at. Evidence of a systematic cover-up of war crimes against Soviet prisoners, who had no Geneva Convention protection and were routinely murdered by the Nazis. She pulled the complete file on Stalag 9B. According to Red Cross inspection reports from January and March 1945, conditions were adequate and no violations observed. The inspectors had been allowed access to most areas, but notably their reports mentioned that certain storage facilities were off-limits due to typhus quarantine. Storage Building 4 was specifically listed as sealed for medical reasons. Emily spent the next week tracking down survivors. Of the approximately 3,000 American prisoners who passed through Stalag 9B, fewer than 30 were still alive in 2022. When she finally reached Gerald Matthews, a 98-year-old former Army sergeant living in Ohio, his reaction to seeing the enhanced photograph was immediate and visceral. "Dear God," he whispered over their video call. "Someone finally got proof." "Mr. Matthews, what am I looking at?" Emily asked gently. Gerald was silent for a long moment, his hands trembling. "The Russians. We called it the Death Building. The Germans thought we didn't know what was happening, but we knew. We heard the trucks arriving at night. We heard the shots. We smelled the burning. Why wasn't this documented after liberation?" Gerald's expression hardened. "Because we were ordered not to talk about it. When Patton's Third Army liberated us on April 2nd, 1945, they found the building. They found what was left. But the Cold War was already beginning. Command decided that publicizing Nazi atrocities against Soviet prisoners would complicate relations with Stalin. We were told it was classified. National security." Emily leaned forward. "Mr. Matthews, I need to know everything, the complete truth." Gerald nodded slowly. Then you'd better come visit, because what you're seeing in that photograph is just the beginning. What Gerald revealed over the next 3 days would expose not just a hidden Nazi atrocity, but a calculated Allied cover-up that lasted nearly 80 years. The true death toll at Stalag 9B was 10 times higher than official records indicated, and the evidence had been deliberately destroyed. Emily flew to Ohio the following week. Gerald Matthews lived in a modest assisted living facility, his room decorated with family photos and military memorabilia. But when they sat down to talk about Stalag 9B, his demeanor changed, the weight of 8 decades of forced silence evident in his eyes. "I need to show you something first," Gerald said, retrieving a metal box from his closet. Inside were documents he'd kept hidden for 77 years, a diary, sketches, and most importantly, a hand-drawn map of the camp. The official German layout showed a single compound, Gerald explained, unfolding the map. But that wasn't accurate. There was a second section, separated by trees and a ravine, invisible from the main camp. That's where they kept the Soviet prisoners. According to Gerald's testimony, approximately 2,400 Soviet POWs were held in this hidden section starting in November 1944. They'd been captured during the failed Warsaw Uprising and Soviet offensives in Poland. "We weren't supposed to know they existed," Gerald continued. "But you could hear them sometimes when the wind was right, and we could see the smoke from the crematorium they'd built in the ravine." Emily cross-referenced this with historical records. She found something chilling. German military railway documents showing regular freight deliveries to Stalag 9B. Far more food and supplies than would be needed for the documented prisoner population. But the deliveries stopped abruptly in December 1944. "That's when the massacre started," Gerald said quietly. "The German army was collapsing. Supply lines were cut. The camp commandant, Oberst Heinrich Vogel, received orders from Berlin. Eliminate all Soviet prisoners. They were considered political commissars and partisans, not protected by any international law." Gerald's diary entries from late January 1945 were meticulous. January 24, 24. Gunfire from the ravine. Continuous for approximately 90 minutes. Guards prevent us from approaching East Fence. January 28th. Trucks arrived after midnight, heard screaming, smell of gasoline and burning, lasted until dawn. February 3rd. Polish prisoner working in German kitchen told me they're being ordered to cook nothing for the others. Starvation protocol. Emily found corroborating evidence in unexpected places. A letter from a German guard, discovered in Bundesarchiv, German Federal Archives, described the special action at Stalag 9B. "We are following Sonderbehandlung protocols. The Russian prisoners are being liquidated in groups of 50 to 100. Those too weak to walk are shot in the barracks. Others are marched to the ravine. It is unpleasant work, but necessary." The letter was dated January 30th, 1945. But here's what made the cover-up possible. When American forces liberated the camp on April 2nd, 1945, the German guards had spent the previous 2 weeks destroying evidence. "They burned the barracks in the hidden section," Gerald explained. "They filled in the mass graves in the ravine with earth and planted fast-growing vegetation. They destroyed all documentation related to Soviet prisoners." Emily obtained the official U.S. Army Liberation Report. It documented 1,247 American prisoners freed, 186 British, 94 French. Soviet prisoners, 0. "But we knew," Gerald said. "The guys who were there in January knew what happened. We tried to tell the officers. Some of us wrote statements." Emily's next question was crucial. What happened to those statements? Gerald's expression darkened. "That's where it gets complicated. Because of who we found in that building, the one in your photograph." Gerald explained that on April 3rd, 1945, the day after liberation, a group of American prisoners led Army investigators to Storage Building 4, which the Germans had left sealed. "We'd seen them loading bodies in there during February," Gerald said. "The Germans ran out of fuel for the crematorium, so they just started stockpiling corpses in the building. They were planning to burn it before we were liberated, but Patton's advance was faster than they expected. When American soldiers opened the building, they found 217 bodies, but these weren't just Soviet prisoners. That's what made everything so complicated," Gerald continued. "Mixed in with the Soviet dead were 12 bodies wearing different uniforms, American uniforms." Emily's research confirmed this horrifying detail. Through cross-referencing missing persons reports and unit records, she identified the Americans, 12 soldiers who had been listed as died of illness or killed attempting escape between December 1944 and March 1945. But the autopsy reports, which Emily obtained through FOIA requests, declassified only in 2019, told a different story. Cause of death: gunshot wound to the back of the head, execution style. "They were murdered," Gerald said flatly. "And we knew why. These 12 had witnessed the massacres. Some had been on work details near the ravine. One, Private Danny Foster from Texas, had befriended a Russian prisoner who spoke English. Danny knew names, dates, details. The German commandant, Oberst Vogel, had ordered their quiet execution to eliminate witnesses. Emily found something even more disturbing in the declassified files. The U.S. Army had known about these executions within days of liberation. Officers had interviewed surviving prisoners, documented the evidence, collected testimony. Then everything was classified. Patton's command made a decision, Gerald explained. This was early April 1945. The war in Europe was almost over, but the war with Japan was still going. And already there were tensions with the Soviets. Command determined that publicizing a massacre of Soviet prisoners and the murder of American witnesses would complicate post-war politics. Gerald showed Emily a document he'd kept, a memorandum distributed to all Stalag 9B survivors on April 15, 1945. Classified, do not discuss. All personnel are hereby ordered not to discuss or disclose information regarding Soviet prisoners, conditions in isolated camp sections, or circumstances of American casualties. Violation will result in court-martial. This order remains in effect indefinitely. "We were ordered to lie," Gerald said, his voice breaking. "We were told that the 12 Americans died of typhus. The official death certificates were falsified, their families were lied to, and the 2,400 Soviet prisoners, according to official records, they never existed." Emily spent the next month tracking down the families of those 12 murdered Americans. Most had no idea how their grandfathers or great-grandfathers actually died. She found Private Danny Foster's niece, Karen Foster Williams, living in Austin, Texas. "My uncle's death destroyed my grandmother," Karen told Emily. She never believed the typhus story. She said Danny had written her a letter in January 1945 talking about something terrible he'd witnessed. That letter never arrived. Intercepted by military censors, we assumed. Now I know why. Emily had uncovered not just a war crime, but a calculated cover-up involving the highest levels of U.S. military command. But the most damning evidence was still to come. Emily's investigation took a crucial turn when she connected with Dr. Hans Weber, a German historian who had spent decades researching Nazi war crimes. Hans had obtained access to recently declassified Soviet archives, documents that had been sealed since 1945. What he found corroborated everything Gerald had described, but with even more horrifying details. Soviet intelligence had conducted their own investigation of Stalag 9B in May 1945, after American forces handed the region over to Soviet occupation. Their report, marked top secret and buried for 77 years, documented finding mass graves containing approximately 2,100 bodies in the ravine area, evidence of systematic execution by shooting and hanging, remnants of destroyed barracks in the hidden camp section, personal effects from Soviet soldiers, including identification tags. The Soviet report concluded approximately 2,400 Soviet prisoners of war were murdered at this location between December 1944 and March 1945. American forces had knowledge of these crimes but failed to prosecute or properly document them. But the Soviets never publicized this information either. Why? Emily found the answer in correspondence between Soviet and American military authorities from June 1945. The two powers made a quiet agreement. Neither side would publicize atrocities that might complicate post-war occupation zones and the emerging Cold War political landscape. The massacre at Stalag 9B became a shared secret between former allies turning into rivals. Emily obtained interrogation transcripts of Nazi personnel captured after the war. Oberst Heinrich Vogel, the camp commandant, was questioned by American investigators in September 1945. His testimony was chilling in its bureaucratic detachment. "I received orders from General Commando to implement Sonderbehandlung for all Soviet prisoners due to food shortages and security concerns. The action was completed over 6 weeks. American prisoners who obtained knowledge of these operations were dealt with according to security protocols. All documentation was destroyed per standing orders." Vogel admitted to ordering the murders of both 2,400 Soviet prisoners and 12 American witnesses. His punishment? 5 years in prison for violations of military protocol. He was released in 1950 and lived quietly in West Germany until his death in 1973. The 12 Americans were never officially acknowledged as murder victims. Their families continued to believe they'd died of disease. Emily tracked down one final crucial document, a memo from U.S. Army intelligence dated April 1946, discussing war crimes prosecution strategy. The Stalag 9B incident presents complications for ongoing relations with Soviet authorities. Recommend case be sealed under national security classification. Prosecution of German personnel involved would require disclosure of the incident, which is not in current strategic interests. The memo was signed by a colonel who would later become a prominent Cold War figure in U.S. intelligence. Emily now understood the full scope. This wasn't just a cover-up of Nazi crimes. It was a calculated political decision by Allied powers to suppress evidence that didn't fit the emerging Cold War narrative. The Soviets wanted to avoid appearing weak or unable to protect their own soldiers. The Americans wanted to avoid complicated questions about why they'd failed to protect American prisoners who witnessed atrocities. And 2,412 men, 2,400 Soviets and 12 Americans, were erased from history. Until one photograph, enhanced 77 years later, revealed the truth that had been hidden in plain sight. In September 2022, Dr. Emily Schneider published her findings in the Journal of Military History. The article, titled "The Hidden Massacre at Stalag 9B, Evidence of Suppressed War Crimes and Cold War Cover-Up," included the enhanced photograph, survivor testimony, declassified documents, and forensic analysis. The response was immediate and international. The German government formally acknowledged the massacre and issued an official apology. Chancellor Scholz stated, "We cannot undo the crimes of the Nazi regime, but we can ensure that all victims are finally recognized and remembered." The Russian government used the revelation for political purposes, criticizing Western cover-ups of crimes against Soviet citizens. But they quietly avoided mentioning their own participation in suppressing the evidence. The U.S. Department of Defense issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging that incomplete documentation and Cold War security concerns had led to gaps in historical record-keeping. They stopped short of calling it a deliberate cover-up, but the most important response came from families. Karen Foster Williams, Private Danny Foster's niece, worked with congressional representatives to have her uncle's death certificate officially corrected. In March 2023, the Army formally acknowledged that Private Foster and 11 other Americans were murdered while prisoners of war not killed by disease as previously reported. The families received formal apologies, and their loved ones were posthumously awarded Purple Hearts. 80 years late. A memorial was erected at the site of former Stalag 9B, now a quiet field in Germany. It bears the names of all 2,412 victims, the 2,400 Soviet prisoners and the 12 American witnesses who died trying to expose the truth. Gerald Matthews, at age 99, traveled to Germany for the memorial dedication in November 2023. He was one of only 4 living survivors of Stalag 9 be able to make the journey. "I thought I'd take this secret to my grave," Gerald said during the ceremony, tears streaming down his weathered face. "We were ordered to forget, to move on, to pretend it never happened. But those men deserved to be remembered. They deserved the truth." Emily's investigation sparked broader research into suppressed World War II atrocities. Historians began re-examining other incomplete records, finding similar patterns of politically motivated cover-ups at other camps and sites. The enhanced photograph itself became a powerful symbol, proof that truth can remain hidden in plain sight for decades, waiting for someone willing to look closer. But perhaps the most profound impact was personal. Emily connected the families of the 12 murdered Americans with descendants of Soviet prisoners, creating an international network of people united by a shared tragedy that both their governments had tried to erase. In June 2024, representatives from these families traveled together to Bad Orb, Germany, to hold a private ceremony at the ravine where the mass graves had been located. They planted trees, 2,412 of them, one for each victim. "My great-grandfather was one of those Soviet prisoners," said Alexei Volkov, a software engineer from Moscow. "I never knew his fate. I thought he'd simply disappeared during the war like millions of others. Now I know he didn't just disappear. He was murdered and then erased. But we're here now. We remember now." The photograph that started it all, the image of exhausted prisoners standing in formation while bodies lay hidden just meters away, now hangs in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum with a plaque that reads, "This photograph from February 1945 shows American POWs at Stalag 9B, Germany. Hidden in the background is evidence of a massacre. The bodies of Soviet prisoners murdered by Nazi guards and American witnesses executed to conceal the crime. Both the atrocity and the cover-up were suppressed for 77 years. This image reminds us that historical truth, no matter how painful or politically inconvenient, must eventually come to light." Emily Schneider continues her work identifying suppressed war crimes. 43 additional cases of covered-up atrocities have been documented since her Stalag 9B investigation. The last surviving witness, Gerald Matthews, passed away in February 2024 at age 100, finally at peace knowing the truth had been told. If this story moved you, subscribe for more hidden histories that deserve to be remembered. And remember, the most important stories are often the ones someone tried to erase.